dirigir el proyecto de GUM Empower, The Causal Effect of Motherhood, Gender Norms and Cash Transfers to Women on Intimate Partner Violence. Me la complicaste con todo eso en inglés. 2024-2028. Recientemente ha coorganizado la OCDE una reunión de un día con investigadores y responsables de política sobre qué funciona para detener la violencia contra las mujeres, evidencia causal, impacto real en el mundo real. Ha sido profesora visitante en el Barnard College de la Universidad de Columbia durante 2020 a 2022 y en la Universidad Pompeu Fabra y el Instituto de Análisis Económica en 2012 y 2013. Antes de trasladarse a Nueva York, fue investigadora en ISA durante los años 2002 a 2015. Profesora adjunta en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona durante 2004 a 2012, profesora afiliada en la Barcelona Graduate School of Economics durante 2007 a 2012, economista en Mathematical Policy Research de la Junta de Gobernadores del Sistema de la Reserva Federal e investigadora en la Brookings Institution en el 97-98. Es un gusto enorme tenerte acá, Nuria. Nuria ha compartido estos 2 días con nosotros, no solo todo su conocimiento en instancias que hemos aprovechado para reunirnos distintos investigadores, estudiantes con ella, sino bueno, compartir instancias más casuales, no causales, sino casuales, de intercambios. La hemos disfrutado muchísimo, también a su familia que está acá acompañándonos hoy. No sé si se escondieron atrás de alguna silla, están acá adelante, y a él se perdió hasta allá atrás. Bueno, nada, es un gustazo tenerte acá. Esperemos tenerla de vuelta próximamente en futuras visitas. Y bueno, Nuria, tenés 40 minutos para charlar. Te aviso a los 15, a los 5. Y muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Gracias.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Es la última presentación y muchas gracias por estar aquí. Es la primera vez que vengo a Montevideo y a Uruguay y me encanta, me encanta. Tenéis datos fantásticos, con lo cual, o sea, todo el feedback que os he dado me lo creo muchísimo y espero ver muchas publicaciones pronto, bueno, lo que nos dan o nos deja el ciclo de economía, que es muy largo, pero realmente podéis hacer muchas cosas muy interesantes en temas de public policy en household economics, con lo cual, bueno, pues espero leeros pronto. También quería agradeceros a todos los organizadores. Esta conferencia o estos 2 días workshops han sido impresionantes, me lo he pasado muy bien. Es complicado organizar. Creo que esto es mío, ¿puede ser? No. Disculpad, es terrible. Pensaba que lo había en una... Disculpad. Bueno, aprovecho, ya que soy la última, agradecer a todos los organizadores y espero no dejarme algún nombre y si me lo dejo, disculparme, no es a propósito. Muchas gracias a Nacho, Andrea, Luciana, Mayra, Victoria, Agustina, Ana, Wanda, Estefanía y hay muchísimas más, o sea que me ha gustado mucho conoceros y muchísimas gracias por organizar esto que ha sido muy complicado porque sesiones paralelas, 4 keynote speakers, muy transversal, pero a mí me ha parecido muy interesante y yo he aprendido mucho de las otras keynotes. Espero que esté yo a la altura. Bueno, y con esto yo creo que ya puedo empezar, ¿vale? Sí. Entonces, este trabajo es parte del proyecto ERC, donde estudiamos cuáles son los factores causales que aumentan o disminuyen el riesgo de victimización o perpetración de violencia dentro de la pareja. En teoría es en países avanzados y con datos secundarios, porque se sabe bastante sobre países middle income y low income, pero no sabemos mucho cuáles son las causas en países avanzados. Y este es uno de los papeles o de los trabajos que forma parte de este proyecto. Entonces, me voy a disculpar, pero voy a pasar a hablar en inglés, porque está concepcionado en inglés y yo, a pesar de ser multilingüe, me cuesta un poco esto. Okay, so this is joint work with Sana Verbal, and the paper uses data from Sweden, so most of it will be topics of Sweden. However, I think that the results are relevant for the whole world. And also I think that Uruguay has some resemblances with Sweden, and I hope that you will find it useful. So violence against women and girls is one of the most pervasive human rights violations globally. If we focus on Uruguay and look at the statistics of Uruguay, 3 in 4 women have or will experience some type of gender violence. Half of the female population in Uruguay will or have experienced lifetime physical or sexual intimate partner violence. And about 1 in 5 women in the last years is a victim of her partner being sexually or physically violent with her. So we compare these numbers to the European statistics, and not because Europe is important, but because the data that I'm analyzing today is from Sweden, a country in Europe. You can see that the statistic on Uruguay, which is about 50% of the women being victim of intimate partner violence in their lifetime, is higher than the average in Europe, which is the red line, but is about the same level than Sweden, which is 48%, right? I think it's, yeah, 48%. So I don't know how comparable Sweden is and Uruguay are. Nonetheless, I mean, I think both countries are known to be very advanced in terms of rights for women and equality. And in this statistic, they're also comparable. So there are the cost of intimate partner violence are very severe, not just emotionally and physically in the short run, but also because they have long-term consequences physically and emotionally, and also in terms of the labor market and the productivity of the woman. However, people forget that the perpetrator sometimes gets caught and also, therefore, suffers the consequences in terms of productivity. All of this to say that it's estimated that in the United States, the cost of intimate partner violence annually are extremely high. And this slide, I know this is a transversal crowd, but this slide is to convince my colleagues, the economists, that intimate partner violence and violence against women is worthwhile studying also in economics. So in this paper, the measure that I will use for intimate partner violence is going to be visits to a hospital because you've been assaulted. And I'll give you more details when I talk about the data on how I measure this variable. But clearly, if we think of violence against women measured as going to the hospital because you've been assaulted, it's the most severe type of violence, and therefore we're observing the tip of the iceberg. So the results, so I think it's important to look at these, although it's not, it's just the tip of the iceberg, because it's the most severe type of violence, and therefore the consequences for women's health, productivity, employment are likely to be the most devastating. Also, to the extent that femicides are the extreme of a continuum of violence, understanding violence against women using hospital data is kind of the place where it's more likely to be closer to the woman being killed. And then finally, because of these, because of the acuteness of the violence and the severity and its consequences, it's where policy is more needed. So at the same time, in Sweden, most women become biological mothers. This presentation today is going to focus not just on violence against women, but also around the time of becoming a mother for the first time. It has quite some external validity to the extent that a lot of women become mothers, but it's also important in terms of policy implications because it's a time where it's easy to reach the woman because she regularly visits primary care or a hospital. In addition, when the woman and the woman and her partner become parents or are thinking about becoming parents or get pregnant, there's a lot of changes that happens in their lives, right? It's also a time of stress, financial and emotional, which increases the vulnerability of the woman. And at the same time, couples spend a lot of time or more time together in the household, which also increases the risk of victimization. So the question that I'm going to ask is having a child, the first child, protective or a risk factor for the incidence and severity of violence against women? Not just intimate partner violence, but generally violence against women. So basically the question is like, if women become mothers, is that going to increase or decrease the risk of victimization? And many of you might think, well, this has already been answered in many fields outside of economics. We have a lot of evidence outside of economics showing that when women become pregnant and mothers, their increase of victimization and the violence against them within the couple increases. However, most of these studies are, well, all of these studies are descriptive and tend to focus on a small group of women who are at high risk, vulnerable, in shelters, or have already gone to the hospital to seek aid, right? So the question is, what happens if instead of looking at these particular samples, which might be very much the women that need most help, but if you extract from that and go to the overall population, what do we know? Well, there is some evidence looking nationally representative samples that study the effect of how intimate partner violence changes around motherhood. And what they usually find is that there's a decrease in pregnancy and also an increase after the birth of the child, especially the first 2 years. Most of these studies are correlational. They're not, they don't use methods to identify causality. In addition, there's a lot of work that does regression analysis and studies the policy. The outcome might be intimate partner violence or violence against women, and they control for number of kids or having kids. That coefficient, which is just a correlation, is always positive and statistically significant. So, and then finally, there are two studies, the ones that I mentioned in the last bullet, that use crime data, longitudinal crime data into very different countries, the US and Brazil. And they do find that motherhood increases assaults by partner. And that reflects both an increase of actual violence, but also an increase of women's desire to report violence. And what I'm going to do now is show you basically the two graphs of these two papers. So here, the first one, oops. No. Oh, no. Anyway, the first graph, the Massenkoff and Rose, what you can see is basically there's an increase in assaults against the female partner that drops when the woman becomes pregnant and then rises again when she becomes a mother. In the other side, it's, for Brazil, you find that there's practically nothing until the woman becomes a mother, and then again, there's an increase in, I think it's assaults or arrest against the father because he's been violent against her. So now I'm going to show you the raw data using Sweden hospitalization records for the whole population of Sweden for 16 years, and where intimate partner violence is measured not as the husband or the partner, male partner, being arrested and recorded by the police, but instead as the woman going to the hospital and being assaulted. And this is basically raw data. And what you can see is so the dotted line is when she becomes pregnant. What you can see is that it's very flat. There's a big drop with pregnancy. There's a rebound after birth, but the level stays significantly lower than the level of violence or the assault. So when we started this research, we expected to find, like everybody else, that after pregnancy, there would be an increase in victimization. In contrast, we find that after pregnancy, there's a decrease in victimization. Okay, so the big question is is this a new stylized fact? So I'm going to show you that with quantitative methods, we find and document that hospital visits for assault decline by 33% when the woman becomes pregnant, and then after birth, or with birth, they drop to 59%. And that's a result that's causal and robust to many robustness checks and sensitivity analysis. However, this contrasts with many theories predicting that pregnancy and motherhood increases women's vulnerability through increased emotional and economic dependence to her partner, increased time at home, creating more opportunities for abuse, and partners' use of the children as tools of control. And in addition to that, this is really kind of in contraposition to the two quantitative studies that use police records that find that after birth, there's an increase in violence, okay? So the purpose of today's presentation is going to be to show you that the result that I show you is indeed true, right? So you have to convince me on that. And then try to reconcile why we find something so different. And I didn't say this, but if you have questions, like clarifying questions, I'm more than happy to answer them in between. I think the discussion is better for the end, though. Okay, so what is going to be our contribution? Well, first, we document that in contrast with the whole literature up until now, there is an overall decline in assault-related hospital visits. It's also, well, we also contribute to the fact that we're using everybody in the population that's medically treated, regardless of the decision to report or not that she's been assaulted by her partner. Sweden has universal childcare, so there's no cost going to the hospital and getting treated. I'm also going to show you results, not just for the average, but I'm going to distinguish for 4 different groups of individuals based on the perpetrator. So I'm going to show you the results for those visits for assaults to the hospital where the woman has said, my partner was the one that did this, okay? I'm also going to show you results when the woman says this happened in a public space. And we're going to assume that if it happened in a public space, most likely it's not the partner. That's number 4. And then in between, and a large majority of our results are unspecified. So the woman arrives to ER, they deal with the problem. They don't ask her what happened. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a multinomial logit with the confirmed cases and a lot of information that we have about at baseline about this woman and her partner and also the type of injury that she has. And we're going to predict the probability of it being intimate partner violence. And then we're going to use those estimators to separate, for the unspecified case, those of high risk of victimization versus low risk of victimization. So the other 2 categories are going to be cases that are very likely to be intimate partner violence, but that the woman did not want to report it, versus cases that we think are very unlikely or are less likely to be intimate partner violence, okay? Then what we're going to do is we're going to use the severity of the injury and also the identification of the perpetrator or not to separately identify changes in actual violence versus changes in reporting behavior. And then finally, we're going to reconcile the things with the literature. So very briefly, so in case I cannot finish or you fall asleep, the main findings. So result number 1, if we focus on violence against women that is not partner violence, what we find is that with motherhood, there's a temporary decrease of the woman being victimized by a stranger. This temporary decrease, we believe it's just the result of the woman changing behaviors. Just like you're likely to drive more carefully, you're also more likely to not go out as much at night, which means that you're less likely to find a stranger that wants to assault you. That's result number 1. Result number 2, so the big decline that we find that I show you in the data is driven by several, but especially for suspected IPV. So we find a big decline for women who have been assaulted, most likely by their partner, but do not want to say that it's their partner. These women tend to be vulnerable women, and also women with either her or her partner having a history of substance abuse. And then the third result, which I think is very interesting, is that we are able to identify diverging patterns of reporting. So on the one hand, if you look at the woman that is confirmed by PV, that they go to the hospital and say, the partner did this, what we find is that there's no overall change, there's no increase, there's no decrease with motherhood. However, there is an increase in intimate partner violence by the partner, declared by the woman, and it happens before the woman wants to separate from the partner or separates from the partner, and especially for the less severe cases of IPV. So it's a lot of going to the hospital to report a violence that occur, but there's no necessary stitches or overnight stay. So we think that this is related to the woman wanting to document a toxic relationship, so it's easier for her to negotiate the way out. On the other hand, what we find is that for suspected IPV, those women that are assaulted by who we think it's a partner, but they don't want to report that it's a partner, the decline following the birth of the child is very much driven by also the less severe cases. And we suspect that this is driven by the fact that this woman doesn't want you to know, doesn't want the doctors to know that their partner have been violent by them, and to the extent possible, avoid going to the hospital, okay? So this is more being concerned that the system will either take custody of the child or the system will do some harm to the partner that she, doesn't want to get rid of or, at least have troubles with. So this is basically the results. So let me tell me very quickly about the data. So this is Swedish data. We have for the whole population. It's multi-generation data set covering all individuals. What we're going to do is, and we have the data from 2001 to 2016. What we're going to do is we're going to follow mothers. So we're going to select the sample to be mothers born between 1965 and 1990 who had a first child between 2002 and 2016. So basically, our mothers are between 18 and 40 years old when they first have a child. On average, they're 29 years old. 90% are living with a partner, with a third being married and the rest cohabitating. 41% have a university degree and 83% were employed with yearly income. Okay, so that's kind of the woman we have in our sample. How do we measure hospital victimization? So we're going to look at ICD-10 diagnosis codes. And basically, for every woman that has a visit to the hospital due to an injury caused by an assault, which is basically ICD-10 diagnosis X85 through Y09, it's going to be 1 if in that quarter she went to the hospital for this reason, 0 otherwise. And, just as a reference, in our data set, in the quarter prior to pregnancy, 0.336 women, there were 0.36 visits for assault per 1,000 mothers. Okay, so the empirical strategy. So we're going to have 2 challenges. The first challenge is selection bias. Mothers are very different from non-mothers. And not just that, the risk of victimization decreases sharply with age. So we need to think a little bit on how we address this selection. So what we did is we're going to compare mothers who have a child in a particular age, let's say me having my first child at age 23, with those women in Sweden who also have a child at age 23, well, actually not at either age 23 plus 1 quarter up to 2 years later. So we're comparing a woman who has her first child at age 23 with all the other women who have a child at 23 and a quarter to 25 years old. Okay? And and basically what we're assuming is that conditional on age and time, once you decide to have a child at age 23, whether you have it exactly at age 23 or within the next 2 years, it's random, okay? And then the second challenge is that going to the hospital can reflect an increase in violence, an increase in risk, putting yourself in risky situations, or an increase in reporting. And hopefully I'm going to convince you that we're able to disentangle some of this. Okay, so again, this is the raw data that you saw at the beginning, so nothing new here. Here is the risk of victimization using our variable based on age. And what you can see is that as women get older, the risk of going to the hospital and because of an assault decreases sharply. So that's why we need to do this, to get to causality, we need to compare it to something that's comparable. And we use this comparison based on age at birth, where basically it's the stag diff and diff. So the only thing I want to point here is that we do have individual fixed effects. So everything that I show you it's not just me compared to a woman just like me who had a child a couple of quarters later, but on top of that, I'm comparing my risk of victimization based on going to the hospital for assault relative to before me being pregnant. Okay, so it's kind of a diff and diff. You're comparing me to myself before and after becoming pregnant relative to women that look exactly like me given when they decided to have birth. Okay, so this is visually what we're doing. Well, let me go here. This is the risk of of going to the hospital for assault. The green line is our mothers, and you can see there's a big drop that starts exactly when she becomes pregnant. The drought is when she gives birth to her child, and then it rebounds, but it's much lower than originally before she became mother. So clearly, there's a decrease in the risk of victimization using this variable, which is going to the hospital due to an assault. These are women who have a child 1 year, 4 to 6 quarters, older, 6 to 8 quarters, and so on. And we stop plotting right before she becomes pregnant because that's when the thing changes. So basically what I'm going to show you from now on is the estimate here relative to a weighted average of here. It's like a difference. And the second difference is like I'm comparing the woman before and after becoming pregnant and having a child. Okay, so this is the basic result. The panel A is percentage points, the panel B is in percent. So basically what you find is that the risk of going to a hospital for assault is pretty much zero. The changes, there's no change before becoming pregnant. It drops about 10% or 8% to 30-something percent to 59% with the birth of the child. And then it rebounds, but it stays kind of, at least for the first year, and even here it stays below, it stays below the, negative, around 18-20%. Okay, so now very quickly, because how much? Okay, so I'm going to go very quickly to show you that this is indeed robust, but I'm just going to be very, very quick. Here what we're doing is we're comparing mothers. We're using the Cleven approach. We're comparing mothers to childless women. And what you can see, what you can see is that there's not much happening for childless women. For the mothers, there is this same drop. So, comparing it using a different methodology, it works. Stack diff and diff has progressed a lot. So there's a lot of different assumptions that, are at risk. When we use the different methods that can address those assumptions, the pattern holds. And then the problem here with these methodologies, I'm just comparing women 23 to 25 because at some point they're no longer comparable. So that's kind of, I can only tell you about 2 years after birth. So if I compare them to single mother, to never mothers, and look up to 8 years after birth, the effect is kind of persistent. Okay, so that's kind of heterogeneity analysis. So what's driving, which type of women are driving these results? So I'm going to look the analysis. I'm going to do the analysis by sociodemographics, predicted probability of leaving a partner, history of substance abuse. And basically it's going to be driven by the vulnerable women with a prior history of substance abuse. So let me go here. So this is no of whatever, and this is yes. So basically it's the drop is mostly driven by younger women, both having or not having a university degree, but it's larger for not having a university degree, larger for not being employed, and larger for leaving their partner. Okay? And then in terms of substance abuse, the effects are much larger if there's a history of substance abuse from the mother or the father. So now what we're going to do is we divided. I'm now going to show you the same graph for 4 types. Whether it's an assault in public space, that's number 4, which basically we're going to assume it's a stranger assaulting you. This is not intimate partner violence. Whether it's confirmed IPV, this is basically either the woman said the partner did this or it happened in my house. And then the other 2 categories are suspected IPV, and we use the multinomial logit using location, perpetrator, diagnosis, medical advice, action, and a lot of baseline characteristics to get to that. and not and then the lower probability of IPV. So this is the data coded by the hospital, right? So in green is the ones where the woman says is IPV. In red, the woman says it happened at home. The assault happened at home. Most Swedish couple don't live with the mother, the grandmother, or whatever. It's basically the two and the kid, if there's a kid. These ones, it happened in public space. The rest of it, which is a big chunk, it's unspecified. It's unspecified because the woman didn't want to say, or the doctor did not have time to record it. So after we do the multinomial logit and reclassify the blue share, so basically these two are going to be our IPV. We just pull them, we don't do anything to it. This one is the same one, which is, by a stranger. And then here we have these, which are women that look very much like IPV victim, that the perpetrator was a partner or an ex-partner, but did not specify it, okay? So here what we also do is we're going to also look at the severity of the reason of the assault, or why you went to the hospital. So there's the less severe. This is somebody that just goes to get a pap smear. She says, I've been assaulted, I just want a pap smear. Or an x-ray, but there's no action, there's nothing broken. This is abuse syndrome. So this is somebody that basically saying, I've been abused. But again, there's no stitches, there's no broken bones. And then these are the cases that we would classify as severe because she stayed overnight, or there was some broken bones or injuries or sticks. And other, I'm not sure, but my co-author, who's the data whiz, classified it, said, we can't really say much about this. Okay, so I'm going to go, because we don't have much time. That was the raw data by types. Let me show you the results. Confirmed IPV, this is basically what most studies are looking at, right? Because it's the ones that the woman went and say. Once you do it causal, there's nothing. Actually, there's a little decline here, and it's statistically significant at birth. This is suspected IPV. Suspected IPV, there's a big drop, and it stays low. Low probability of IPV, it's the same pattern. Public spaces, it's a drop, but it's temporary, right? Which is kind of, this is basically the woman is incapacitating herself because she's no longer going out and meeting, violent men that at random. Okay, so now let's talk about changes in actual violence versus changes in reporting or care-seeking behavior. So basically what we find, let me tell you the result we find. For confirmed IPV, so these are women that go to the hospital and say, indeed, I was assaulted by my partner. What we find is that in these cases, it increases. There's a pattern that I will show you that there's an increase when the woman leaves her partner. And we also observe that some increase, and it's not that we don't have too much precision, but we also observe that there's an increase in confirmed IPV for the less severe cases of going to the hospital for assault. In contrast, for the suspected IPV, there's substantial declines, especially for the less severe cases. So that basically means like these women do not want to, or do not report that their partner assaulted them. They very much look like their partner assaulted them. And that big drop is mostly for less severe cases. So they're avoiding going to the hospital because they don't want the hospital staff to know for why, that they were assaulted. Okay? So we suspect that this pattern indicates that some women are avoiding going to the hospital to circumvent mandatory reporting, which is current, it's active in Sweden. Yeah. So basically that's the major result. Now I'm going to show you some graphs to corroborate this result. So this is basically a regression. We do it panel A for confirmed IPV, panel B for suspected IPV. And instead of doing the event study, we have a dummy for being pregnant, a dummy for the first year of birth of the child, and the second year of birth of the child. So if we focus on confirmed IPV, I think that and this is different types of going assaults. going to the hospital for different reasons of assault. This is the less severe case, or I've been abused, but there's really no injury. Here, it's bone fracture and severe injury, and this is the other. So I think that what's very interesting is that for confirmed IPV, there's a clear decline in violence, in severe violence, both at pregnancy, the first and second year of the child. That's very different from what the literature finds. However, when we look at the less severe, or the woman wanting to report that it's an abuse, it's not statistically significant, but we clearly find positive effects, and they're here. When we go to suspected IPV, most of the decline is the less severe one. Some also going on more severe, but it's the less severe one. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you is, it's the same pattern, but now I'm going to do it by whether the woman is single, leaves the partner, or stays with the partner. So the single women, so this is confirmed IPV. The single women clearly had a partner to become pregnant, but they're single because when the child was born, the father was not around and they did not declare the child. Well, when it's confirmed IPV, when the woman wants to show, what we see is like, and this is the green, well, there's a lot of choppiness, but there's a huge increase. Wait. The single is the blue. So what we see is like there's a big increase here, which is the first quarter of her pregnancy. So this woman had a partner, gets pregnant, doesn't want the partner in her life, separates the partner around the pregnant, like the first quarter, and that's where violence increases. And then pretty much the violence decreases and there's nothing. For those who leave the partner, the spike comes around, I think this is quarters, about half a year after the child is born, right? There's this spike and there's this other spike. And for those who don't leave the partner, there's not much, there's not much really happening. Maybe something here, but there's not much. In contrast, for suspected IPV, doesn't really matter whether you're single, you leave the partner, or you're staying. The pattern is always the same. There's a clear decrease that starts with pregnancy and pretty much stays like that. 5 minutes, yes. Okay, so reconciling the results with the literature and policy implications. So again, the main findings is for violence against women initiated by a complete stranger in a public space, there is a behavioral change. So there's a drop that in assaults, hospital visits for assaults, which is our measure of violence against women. This drop is temporary, and we believe that it reflects woman's behavioral changes due to the fact that she becomes pregnant and changes her lifestyle. When she goes back to her normal lifestyle after the child is born, that risk goes back to where it was. For suspected IPV, so these are women who we think were assaulted by their partner but do not report it. There's a persistent decline in hospital visits for assault, especially among vulnerable women and those who have a history of substance abuse, them or their partner. We've also identified a divergent reporting pattern. For these women, the decline seems to be driven by less severe motifs. And what we think is they're trying to hide. If they only go to the hospital if they really need to go to the hospital. Otherwise, they stay home so that the partner doesn't get in trouble or they don't lose custody of the child. In contrast, for those who is confirmed by PV, there's nothing happening except that there's an increase in the reporting of the less severe cases that tends to happen around the time when there is a separation, when there is a separation. Okay, so we think it's a reporting device to kind of have a more negotiating power. Okay, so how do we reconcile this with the literature? The two studies that look at causal or estimate causal effects, like us, they use police records. And what they find is there's an increase after pregnancy, after birth, on police reporting. And you can we also find an increase in reporting for those women who want to tell us that it's IPV. So you can perfectly have an increase in reporting and at the same time a decrease in severe cases. There might also be substitution, right? We're not saying that IPV disappears. It might be that the partner now exerts violence in a different way, but that we cannot get to it. So I think that's okay. So now in terms of policy implications, so I think that one of the policy implications is that pregnancy and early motherhood represents a critical intervention window, particularly for vulnerable women. So it's important that there's screening and regular screening, from practitioners and, like healthcare provider around that time. We also find that substance abuse is kind of in the picture a lot. So maybe one of the policy implications is that among women or their partners who have substance abuse history, to kind of have some kind of training or notion or screening on violence, because it's likely that that's going to be that there might be there. So what I think is interesting also is that we find that women are selective on going to the hospital after an assault based on kind of the situation in the life they are, and based on whether they want to stay or not with the father of the child. So that's kind of telling us that this is a problem, especially these women are avoiding hospital help that they really need. So in some ways, some of the policy implications is, allowing healthcare providers greater discretion in reporting decisions when the children are not at immediate risk. The other one is separating maternal health care encounters from child protective service interventions, and also providing confidential care options for non-life-threatening injuries. So that's pretty much it. This is my team of Women Empower. We have capacity for more postdocs. So right now we have 3. We could grow up to 6. So if you know of anybody that wants to go and live in Barcelona and study this type of research, let me know. Thank you.
Bueno, Nuria, muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Tiempo perfecto. Abrimos una ronda de preguntas, si les parece. Pueden ir levantando la mano, nos vamos acercando. Mayra me abandonó en la tarea.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación, Nuria. Muy clara, me gustó mucho el trabajo. Felicitaciones. Tengo 2 preguntas. La primera es si tienen datos de los perpetradores, porque hay como reincidencias y capaz que es importante saber quiénes tenían esas, y si las mujeres ya habían declarado o no. Eso por un lado. Y lo segundo que me quedó es saber si ustedes saben si son inmigrantes o no, y el rol que podría llegar a tener la familia en la instancia, no solamente de estar ahí solos o no, o si en el momento en que nacen los hijos, los nietos, por ejemplo, si están más involucrados, y eso hace que tener como otra contención disminuye la probabilidad de que se generen estas situaciones de violencias extremas que lleven a que las personas hagan las denuncias o que terminen hospitalizadas por los maltratos. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, gracias. Súper interesante. Te quería preguntar si ¿qué tipo de tipos de violencia incluye el protocolo? Si es física o también hay algo de violencia más psicológica, y si podría haber un cambio en eso antes, durante y después del embarazo que tuviese hay que ver. Y después, si el embarazo, si hay como información sobre si el propio embarazo está vinculado como a algún episodio de abuso o violencia, y si eso podría tener algún efecto. Y después me preguntaba si o sea, antes, bueno, tenés a las mujeres yendo a controlarse regularmente. Después, no entendí bien si, si se puede aprovechar cuando van con el bebé, con el niño, por lo menos, no sé, más o menos hasta el primer año son los controles, si ahí están mirando, o si si están mirando solo si la mujer va por consulta de violencia, si esos otros controles no se podrían como aprovechar también.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación, súper interesante. Este tema de violencia no es el mío, pero me surgieron algunas preguntas. La primera es si tenían información de quiénes son estas mujeres que se separan luego de la maternidad, porque estás mirando como un periodo relativamente corto, o sea, son 2 años después de haber tenido el primer hijo. Entonces me imagino que las mujeres que toman la decisión de separarse en ese periodo, que es un poco crítico, pueden ser distintas, y eso puede dar luz también, pensando en esto de cuáles son las outside options de estas mujeres que toman la decisión de separarse, y en qué medida eso interactúa con la maternidad. En tanto, en Suecia las políticas de familia son mucho más generosas, en particular tienen licencias súper extensas de 1 año y medio y súper bien remuneradas. Entonces quizás la maternidad de alguna manera genera una alternativa para que mujeres puedan darse el lujo de salir de relaciones que de repente ya venían generando este tipo de violencias, y capaz que eso, no sé, cómo se armonizan de alguna manera con cómo las políticas de familia entran acá como una outside option que de alguna manera dialoga en este vínculo que vos encontrás entre la maternidad y la violencia interna de la pareja.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. No, mi pregunta es si saben algo respecto de los segundos o ulteriores hijos, si esto tiene, nada, si está solo estudiado para el primer hijo. Y otra pregunta es si tienen idea si en esos 2 años aparece un segundo embarazo, si eso no empeora las circunstancias.
No, aprovecho, gracias por la presentación, Nuria. La pregunta de banda sobre si tienen información respecto a violencia en hijos, hijas de estas mujeres.
Y aprovecho que traigo el micrófono para hacer la última pregunta, vinculado también al médico o médica que recibe a la persona cuando llega con alguna herida. Si hay, bueno, ¿cómo sería el protocolo? Si hay diferencias por el sexo del doctor, capaz que hay una especie como de misreporting según sea varón o mujer el doctor que te atiende. Y también vinculado como a lo que preguntaba Florencia de la inmigración, que a veces el idioma puede ser una barrera a la hora de reportar determinados tipos de violencia.
A ver lo que contesto, porque son muchas preguntas. A ver. Voy a intentar, voy a intentar. Sí, a ver, ¿qué sabemos de los perpetradores? Es Suecia y en teoría lo tenemos todo. A la práctica, en este proyecto solo tenemos derecho a utilizar los datos hospitalarios. Entonces, no podemos machearlo con... machear en Suecia solo se puede si están casados o cuando nace el hijo, puedes machearlo porque si el padre sale declarado en los papeles. Pero bueno, nosotros en este proyecto no lo podemos hacer. Hemos mirado porque Sana tiene acceso a crime data, police records, y cuando lo miramos, hacemos el análisis que se ha hecho con police records en Estados Unidos y en Brasil, encontramos lo mismo. Pero esa no es la pregunta de reincidencia, o sea, eso no... Podríamos mirar si la mujer ha ido antes, hubiese ido antes, se ha tenido un caso antes del embarazo, y creo que hicimos algo de esto, pero no hay muchas. O sea, ir reincidentemente al hospital no hay muchas en Suecia. Entonces no nos da mucho. Pero bueno. ¿Inmigrantes o no? A ver, ¿inmigrantes o no? También, Flor. El análisis lo miramos, empezamos antes de la pandemia. Hemos mirado heterogeneidad por inmigración y no hemos encontrado que el pattern sea distinto para inmigrantes y no inmigrantes. Con lo cual, allá no hemos indagado más. Tampoco hemos mirado nada de si los inmigrantes tienen o no tienen familia. Ahí no, lo podemos mirar, supongo, pero no hemos entrado. Entonces, Andrea nos pide sobre protocolo y Luciana también. En Suecia hay un protocolo de que si tú entras en el hospital y el médico identifica que eres víctima, lo tiene que report para la mujer. Pero sí, y también hay otro protocolo de que si el niño está en peligro, también hay que hacer reporting. Entonces, no sé si esto es Entonces, lo de violencia emocional versus física, mi lectura es que cuando hacemos by severity, el abusive syndrome es la emocional, creo yo, ¿no? Porque no hay nada físico, entonces ahí es donde. Pero tenía que mirarlo más en el tema del protocolo. Y había otra cosa. Y había lo del género del médico. Sí, no sé si tenemos género del médico, lo podríamos mirar, pero no lo sé y no lo hemos mirado, porque no lo sé. ¿Vale? Ok. ¿Qué más? ¿Quién se separa? Mariana. No lo sé, tenemos que mirar quién se separa. Es verdad que en Suecia hay outside options. Y también sé que si no en Suecia, en Dinamarca, que es un país muy similar, cuando hay políticas expansivas de familia, la probabilidad de tener el segundo hijo decrece. Y yo creo que tiene que ver con, estás más en casa, identificas mejor al marido y no te vas a poner a tener un segundo hijo si la relación no funciona, ¿no? Esto es un resultado que me enteré la semana pasada en Rockwool, en Copenhague, pero creo que va un poco en esa línea. O sea, es verdad que este estudio está hecho en Suecia, con lo cual las mujeres suecas sí que tienen muchos recursos si deciden separarse del padre. Es mucho más fácil que en México. Hay un estudio muy interesante mirando maternidad y violencia en México con chicas jóvenes que sobre todo tienen embarazos no deseados. Y ahí encuentran un big spike y lo instrumentan con farmacias cerca donde pueden comprar the pill of the day after y la historia es muy distinta y hemos hablado mucho con la autora y realmente pensamos que la historia depende mucho de los servicios que se ofrecen y las alternativas que se dan a las mamás. Entonces, sí. Aunque creo que es importante. Es verdad que encontramos un resultado muy nuevo, pero porque es al revés de lo que se encontraba hasta ahora. Y dos, porque encontramos que hay una historia reporting y que la historia reporting cambia en función de si la mujer realmente quiere que se sepa o no que el perpetrator es una pareja, ¿no? Pero creo que también es importante ver que en aquellos IPVs que no quieren decirte que hay la pareja, la caída no necesariamente es una caída de violencia, es una caída de ir menos al hospital. That's it, ¿no? O sea, podría haber sustitución y puede ser que estas mujeres las peguen igual o más, pero no van al hospital. O sea, que no necesariamente. Pero, o sea, ahí lo dejo, ¿no? Yo creo que contesto casi todo. Segundo hijo. Lo hemos hecho con el segundo hijo y el pattern sigue igual. Sí, porque hay un paper muy distinto, o sea, la misma pregunta, mismos datos, pero hecho de otra manera, donde lo hacíamos solo con IPV y hacíamos muchas cosas para demostrar que era IPV y no una persona desconocida y entonces, bueno, y mecanismos Y el segundo hijo salía un poquito menos, pero salía igual, pater. Sí. Yo creo que he contestado todo, pero si no, muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Nuria. Bueno, le pedimos a Nacho que suba para hacer unos avisitos finales. Agradecerles a todas y a todos, especialmente a Nuria y a Nara, que viajaron para estar estos días aquí, y las exponentes que estuvieron vía Zoom, y también a todas las participantes que vinieron del extranjero para compartir estos días de intercambios y ricas discusiones con nosotros. Le paso el micrófono a Nacho, que es el encargado de los avisos. Bueno, y especialmente felicitar a las organizadoras, a Andrea y a Wanda, que fueron las corresponsables de este barco durante tantos años, ¿no? No solo esta edición del GEF, sino que esta es la tercera de 4 años de 12 años consecutivos.
Bueno, gracias, Luciana. Mi misión acá es avisar 3 cosas. La primera es un poco... ¿Queda café? No sé si queda café, pero bueno, ¿pueden probar si queda café? Sí. ¿Queda café? Bueno, 4 entonces. La otra era agradecer obviamente a todos, sobre todo a los que vinieron de más lejos, y también ponderar el trabajo. Esto es un poco autorreferente, pero de todo el grupo que organizó, sobre todo las personas de las 2 coordinadoras del GEF, Wanda y Andrea, pero también de todos los miembros del grupo, del comité organizador. Bueno, lleva un trabajo organizar estas cosas y estamos muy contentos que salió bien. Hubo como mucho interés, muchas preguntas, muchas exposiciones interesantes, 4 conferencias buenísimas de gente que vino de lejos en casi todos los casos. Así que bueno, eso, gracias a todos. Esperemos volver a verlos en algún lugar con eventos semejantes. Y luego 2 anuncios mucho más prácticos que esto. El primero es que nos queda todavía una actividad no académica, para la que algunos de ustedes están anotados, pero podrían anotarse o sumarse algunos más que quieran. Se trata de una recorrida llamada Montevideo Sonoro, por la música de uno de los barrios de Montevideo, el barrio sur. Así que ahí va a haber algo parecido a un tour donde nos van a contar un poco y vamos a escuchar y vamos a ver algunos de los lugares. Imagino, siendo el barrio que es, el ritmo paradigmático de Montevideo, que es el candombe, un ritmo afro-uruguayo que tiene muchas canciones que en su mayoría iremos visitando con esa guía de audio. Nunca fui, pero imagino que es muy interesante. Todos tenemos buenos comentarios de que es una cosa muy linda para hacer, si vienen de otras ciudades, o incluso para nosotros, varios de nosotros vamos a ir, aunque vivamos acá. Así que ese nivel de fe le tenemos a esa actividad. 6:15 nos juntamos aquí en la puerta para llegar 6:30 a la Plaza Citarrosa. Los que ya se tengan mucha fe para andar por Montevideo podrían ir derecho por ahí, pero si no, quizá mejor 6:15 podemos ir todos juntos. Y la última es que van a estar colgadas las 4 conferencias que han sido grabadas. Nosotros vamos a enviarle los enlaces para esto, pero los que tengan una gran ansiedad por verlas ya, también las tienen en el canal de YouTube de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas, cuya sigla es esta que está aquí. Así que se puede encontrar también muy fácilmente ahí, pero les vamos a enviar los links para quienes quieran repasar esos 4 momentos. Y dicho todo esto, si nadie tiene un anuncio de último momento, muchas gracias nuevamente y bueno, esperemos seguir en contacto con todos ustedes hasta el próximo momento. Gracias.